I saw my son smiling beside his wife in a luxury airport lounge while $175,000 from my retirement account paid for their first class escape. But the money was not what shattered me most. It was realizing the boy I once protected had quietly forged my signature, stolen my trust, and gambled away the life his father and I spent decades building. That was the moment I stopped asking how this happened and started planning what would happen next. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. The desert mornings in Scottsdale always carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that made a person hear their own thoughts too clearly. At 68 years old, I had grown used to that silence. It waited for me every morning behind the heavy glass doors of my kitchen, beyond the pale sunlight stretching across the stone patio, and the rows of rose bushes I still insisted on tending myself. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and 5 years after my husband Richard died, the house still felt like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. The coffee machine hummed softly while I stood at the sink, looking out over the backyard. The roses were beginning to bloom again despite the Arizona heat. Richard used to joke that I treated those flowers better than I treated people. At the time, I laughed whenever he said it. Now, standing alone in a kitchen far too large for one person, the memory no longer seemed funny. I carried my coffee outside and lowered myself carefully into one of the wrought iron chairs beside the garden. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant sound of landscaping crews and sprinklers clicking across expensive lawns. Most of the people living in our part of Scottsdale spent summers elsewhere. Aspen, Napa Valley, Europe. I stayed here year-round because leaving the house felt too much like abandoning Richard all over again. Inside, everything remained exactly where he left it. His reading glasses still rested beside the leather chair in the den. His golf shoes remained lined neatly in the garage. Some rooms I barely entered anymore, because they carried too much memory. Before retirement, I owned an art gallery in Santa Barbara for nearly 30 years. It had once been my entire identity. I built exhibitions, attended auctions, hosted charity events, and spent decades convincing wealthy people to spend absurd amounts of money on paintings they barely understood. The gallery made us comfortable. After selling it, Richard and I invested carefully, and our savings grew far beyond what we ever truly needed. Richard believed in structure. He trusted paper records, handwritten notes, and routines that never changed. So did I. Every month, I still reviewed printed bank statements at the dining room table with a pen in my hand, like it was still 1998. Ethan used to laugh at that. My son lived in Santa Barbara now, with his wife Vanessa. Online, their life looked flawless. White wine on yachts, oceanfront restaurants, designer clothes, smiling photographs beneath captions about gratitude and success. Vanessa built an entire career around pretending their life was effortless. Sometimes I stared at those pictures longer than I should have, searching Ethan's face for traces of the little boy who once sat cross-legged on my gallery floor painting terrible watercolor sunsets while I worked late into the evening. Back then, he adored me. Somewhere along the line, admiration slowly turned into distance, then resentment. Now, most conversations between us somehow circled back to money, investments, real estate, opportunities. Ethan never directly asked for help anymore. Instead, he hinted. He mentioned rising expenses or difficult markets or friends making fortunes in new ventures. And every time my phone rang unexpectedly, I felt my stomach tighten before answering. That morning, while finishing my coffee, I opened Instagram and saw Vanessa's newest post. She and Ethan stood together on the deck of a yacht somewhere off the California coast, both wearing sunglasses, both smiling as if life had never disappointed them once. I studied my son's face for a long moment. Then I realized something that unsettled me far more than loneliness ever had. I no longer recognized the man smiling back at me. After staring at Ethan's photograph on my phone for several minutes, I finally locked the screen and placed the device face down on the patio table. The Arizona sunlight had already turned harsh, bleaching the mountains in the distance into pale outlines. Somewhere nearby, a hummingbird fluttered through my rose bushes, moving with the kind of restless energy I no longer possessed. Lately, every interaction with my son left me feeling strangely hollow. It had not always been that way. There was a time when Ethan called simply to tell me about a movie he had seen, or a painting that reminded him of my gallery. Now, our conversations felt measured, cautious, as if both of us were avoiding some truth sitting quietly between us. Over the past few weeks, I had also begun receiving strange emails from the bank. Security alerts, verification notices, requests to confirm login attempts from unfamiliar devices. At first, I blamed modern technology. Richard always handled online banking and passwords when he was alive. I still preferred paper statements and handwritten reminders tucked into drawers. I used the same passwords for far too many accounts because complicated systems exhausted me. That afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded unusually warm, almost cheerful. He explained that he and Vanessa planned to fly to Scottsdale for a quick visit before a work event in California. He claimed they missed me and wanted family time. Family time. The phrase sounded almost foreign coming from him. After we ended the call, I spent the next day preparing the house despite repeatedly telling myself not to get emotionally invested. I bought fresh flowers for the dining room. I cleaned the upstairs guest bedroom that had remained untouched for months. I even stocked the refrigerator with Vanessa's preferred sparkling water because I still remembered small details about people I loved. They arrived late Friday afternoon. Vanessa entered first wearing oversized sunglasses and expensive cream-colored linen that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She kissed my cheek dramatically and immediately began filming snippets of the backyard with her phone. The entire visit felt strangely performative. While Vanessa admired artwork and furniture loud enough for social media videos to capture, Ethan wandered through the house with quiet curiosity. He lingered in my office longer than necessary. He asked where I kept old gallery records and whether I still manage investments personally. At dinner, the conversation drifted toward aging in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable. Ethan casually asked whether I had ever considered downsizing the house someday. Vanessa laughed and called the property a gold mine sitting in the desert. She said it lightly, but I noticed Ethan watching my reaction carefully. For a brief moment, I remembered something Richard once told me years ago, after Ethan purchased a luxury car he could barely afford. He chases appearances because he thinks success is something people need to see. At the time, I defended our son fiercely. Now I was no longer certain Richard had been wrong. That night, sometime after midnight, I woke feeling thirsty and walked downstairs in my robe. The hallway lights were off, but a dim glow spilled from beneath my office door. Ethan stood beside my desk when I entered. He turned quickly, almost too quickly. He claimed he had been searching for aspirin because of a headache. The explanation sounded harmless, yet something immediately unsettled me. One of my desk drawers sat slightly open, and several financial folders no longer rested where I normally kept them. I said nothing. The next morning, Ethan and Vanessa left far earlier than planned. Vanessa hugged me tightly and promised we would all vacation together soon. Ethan smiled more than usual, but his eyes looked distracted. After their car disappeared down the street, I walked upstairs and noticed my closet door slightly open. A cold feeling crept through me. I checked the hidden wall safe behind Richard's old jackets. Everything appeared untouched at first glance. Then I noticed one stack of banking documents sitting at a slightly different angle. And suddenly, with terrifying clarity, I remembered Ethan standing behind me during Christmas dinner months earlier while I entered the safe code. I barely slept after Ethan and Vanessa left Scottsdale. Every sound inside the house seemed sharper than usual. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the creaking pipes behind the walls, even the desert wind brushing against the windows felt unsettling somehow. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up trying to sleep and sat alone in the kitchen staring at the stack of banking papers I had removed from the safe. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. People forgot where they placed documents all the time. Grief changed memory. Aging changed confidence. I repeated those thoughts over and over because the alternative was unbearable. Still, something inside me refused to settle. The next morning, my coffee tasted unusually bitter. I sat at the dining room table with my reading glasses low on my nose and forced myself to open the recent banking emails I had ignored for weeks. Navigating online accounts always frustrated me. Richard handled most of that before his death, and after losing him, I learned only enough to survive digitally. The screen filled with verification notices and transaction confirmations I did not recognize. Several messages referenced wire transfers. Others mentioned identity authentication approvals. At first, I assumed the emails were scams. The world seemed full of scams now, especially targeting older people. But the logo matched my bank exactly, and the account numbers were mine. A cold sensation spread slowly through my chest. I called First Horizon Private Banking immediately. The woman who answered sounded calm at first, but her tone shifted the moment I explained why I was calling. She transferred me directly to someone in fraud protection without hesitation. Within minutes, I learned that approximately $175,000 had been transferred from my retirement accounts over the previous 3 weeks. The money had been wired into a limited liability company registered in Nevada. I felt physically ill. My fingers tightened around the phone so hard they began to ache. The room tilted slightly, forcing me to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. The representative explained that every transfer appeared fully authorized using my digital credentials, electronic signature, and verification codes. Whoever initiated the transactions knew my personal information in detail. I could barely breathe after the call ended. For several minutes, I simply sat there staring at the framed family photographs along the dining room wall. Ethan, at 12, holding a fishing rod beside Richard. Ethan graduating college in an expensive suit we could barely afford at the time. Ethan smiling beside Vanessa on their wedding day. Looking back, I realized how many times I had rescued him financially over the years. Unpaid credit card debt, failed investments, short-term business loans that somehow never disappeared. Ethan always recovered the same way. A charming apology, a convincing promise, a confident new opportunity waiting just around the corner. At noon, I drove to the bank in Scottsdale. A private banker named Daniel Mercer met me in a quiet office overlooking the parking garage. He spoke carefully, professionally, but I could see concern behind his expression. He explained that the fraud appeared sophisticated and intentional. Then he revealed something even worse. Someone had recently initiated a home equity loan against my Scottsdale property. The application included forged tax records, copies of identification documents, and my electronic signature. I immediately thought of the safe, of Ethan standing inside my office at midnight, pretending to search for aspirin. Daniel paused before asking the question I had been avoiding myself. "Has anyone close to you had access to your home recently?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, I nodded once. I still could not say Ethan's name aloud. Daniel advised me to freeze my accounts immediately and begin legal fraud protection procedures. I agreed mechanically, barely hearing half of what he said anymore. Inside the parking garage afterward, my phone buzzed with a social media notification. Vanessa had posted another video. Designer luggage sat beside champagne glasses in what looked like an airport lounge. The caption read, "European escape begins tomorrow." Then I noticed Ethan in the background wearing Richard's vintage gold watch, the same watch my husband treasured for 40 years. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt afraid of my own son. The Scottsdale sky burned deep orange as I drove home from the bank, the desert heat still pressing heavily against the windshield long after sunset. Usually, I loved evenings in Arizona. The quiet streets, the distant mountains glowing beneath fading light, the soft rustle of palm trees in wealthy neighborhoods where everything appeared calm and secure. That evening, the entire city felt unreal to me. I parked inside the garage and sat motionless behind the steering wheel for several minutes, unable to gather enough strength to walk into the house. $175,000 was gone. Worse than the money itself was the realization slowly poisoning my thoughts. Ethan had not acted impulsively. This had taken planning. Inside, I carried boxes of financial records onto the dining room table and spent hours reviewing statements beneath the yellow glow of the chandelier. Around midnight, I finally noticed the pattern. Small withdrawals, minor transfers, tiny transactions scattered carefully across nearly 2 years. Amounts too small to attract immediate attention. My chest tightened painfully. I remembered Ethan sitting beside me during holidays, asking harmless questions about investments. I remembered him borrowing my laptop when his battery supposedly died. After Richard's funeral, Ethan even helped organize paperwork while I wandered through grief like a sleepwalker. Piece by piece, he had gathered access to my life. Still, part of me desperately searched for another explanation. Mothers are experts at inventing excuses for their children. Even then, even surrounded by evidence, some wounded corner of my heart wanted to believe this nightmare had a misunderstanding hidden somewhere inside it. The next morning, I called Harold Bennett, our longtime family attorney in Phoenix. Harold had semi-retired years earlier, but he agreed to meet me privately that afternoon. He listened quietly while reviewing the loan applications and transfer records spread across his office desk. Unlike the bankers, Harold did not look shocked. He looked tired, sadly familiar. He explained that elder financial abuse had become increasingly common among wealthy retirees, especially when family members gained digital access over time. Hearing myself described as a possible victim humiliated me more than I expected. Harold eventually removed his glasses and studied me carefully before speaking again. "This appears highly organized, Margaret." The words hollowed something inside me. Harold contacted a forensic financial investigator he trusted, and within hours, new information began surfacing. Ethan's luxury real estate partnerships were collapsing beneath massive debt. Creditors were preparing lawsuits. Several projects in California had quietly failed months earlier. Suddenly, Ethan's desperation made terrifying sense. For a moment, I remembered him at 16 after receiving a poor report card, standing rigidly in Richard's office while trying not to cry. Ethan always feared disappointing his father. Somewhere along the line, achievement became more important to him than honesty. Then Harold revealed something I never expected. Years before his death, Richard had quietly established a family protection trust connected to our estate. Buried within the documents was a clause protecting me from financial exploitation, including exploitation by immediate family members. If fraud could be proven, Ethan would permanently lose inheritance rights. I stared at Harold in stunned silence. Richard had seen this possibility long before I did. Part of me felt grateful. Another part felt furious that my husband understood our son more clearly than I ever had. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued posting glamorous travel videos online. Champagne tastings, designer luggage, Mediterranean yacht reservations, Monaco hotel tags. Yet behind Ethan's expensive smile, I began noticing strain, tiny flashes of panic hidden beneath forced confidence. Harold advised immediate criminal charges. I refused. Not yet. Instead, a colder clarity settled over me. For the first time since Richard died, I stopped feeling helpless. That evening, I quietly contacted Delta Concierge Services and confirmed Ethan and Vanessa's international itinerary, departing from Los Angeles 3 days later. After hanging up, I booked my own flight without telling anyone. If my son wanted a performance, I decided I would give him one he would never forget. Los Angeles International Airport felt loud enough to drown human thought. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors, while overhead announcements echoed endlessly through the international terminal. Travelers hurried toward gates carrying luxury shopping bags, passports, and exhausted children. Everywhere I looked, people were leaving for somewhere beautiful. I arrived nearly 2 hours early and sat quietly near the first-class lounge, pretending to read a magazine I never actually opened. Then I saw them. Vanessa stood beneath bright terminal lighting, filming herself beside a tower of designer luggage. Her voice carried easily across the crowded waiting area as she described their European dream tour to thousands of followers online. Ethan stood beside her, wearing a fitted navy jacket, and Richard's vintage gold watch gleaming beneath the airport lights. The sight of that watch nearly stopped my breathing. Richard wore it every day for 40 years. It represented discipline, honesty, responsibility. Seeing it now wrapped around Ethan's wrist felt almost obscene. For several minutes, I simply watched them from a distance. Vanessa radiated excitement, but Ethan looked different. He smiled constantly, yet his eyes kept darting toward his phone. His confidence looked strained, brittle somehow. Underneath the polished image, my son already appeared exhausted. And suddenly, I remembered another airport decades earlier. Ethan, at 8 years old, running through Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport holding Richard's hand before our first family trip to Hawaii. He had been so excited he could barely stand still. Back then, airports represented adventure and family and safety. Now I barely recognized the man standing before me. I walked toward them slowly. Vanessa noticed me first. Her face lit up instantly, assuming this was some loving surprise visit she could share online. "Margaret!" Ethan turned around. The color drained from his face immediately. I stopped directly in front of them and looked at my son for several long seconds before speaking. "Did you enjoy spending my retirement money?" Vanessa's smile disappeared. Her phone remained pointed directly at us, still live streaming. Ethan stepped closer quickly and lowered his voice, asking if we could talk privately. I refused without hesitation. Years of silence had brought us here. I no longer cared about appearances, so I told the truth. I spoke calmly about the wire transfers, the forged signatures, the home equity loan against my house. Around us, travelers slowed down. Curious faces turned toward the growing tension. Vanessa panicked and tried ending the live stream, but the damage was already done. Ethan insisted he planned to repay everything eventually. Even then, even standing in the middle of public humiliation, he still sounded more defensive than remorseful, and suddenly I realized something devastating. He truly believed explanations mattered more than betrayal. I told him I trusted him after Richard died because he was all I had left. Saying those words aloud hurt more than I expected. For one brief second, guilt flashed across Ethan's face. Then anger replaced it. He accused me of caring more about money than family. He claimed I spent his entire childhood emotionally unavailable behind gallery walls and financial spreadsheets. Part of me recognized truth buried inside his accusations, but I also recognized something else. Ethan had learned to weaponize guilt whenever consequences approached. Airport security officers began moving toward us through the crowd while Vanessa whispered frantically about sponsorships, followers, and ruined partnerships. Then Ethan finally snapped. He shouted that the inheritance would belong to him eventually anyway. The silence afterward felt enormous. Something inside me broke permanently in that moment. Before either of us could speak again, two sharply dressed individuals approached quietly and identified themselves as federal financial investigators. They informed Ethan they needed to question him regarding ongoing interstate fraud investigations connected to his shell company. Vanessa looked horrified. For the first time that day, Ethan appeared truly afraid. As the agents escorted him aside, he turned back toward me with the terrified expression of a lost child rather than a confident man nearing 40. And standing there beneath the harsh airport lights, I realized revenge never feels as victorious as people imagine. After the federal agents escorted Ethan away from the terminal crowd, the noise of Los Angeles International Airport suddenly felt distant and muffled, as if I were underwater. I sat alone near a quiet waiting area beside the international gates, staring through massive glass windows at planes taxiing across the runway beneath the afternoon sun. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt hollow. My hands trembled lightly around a paper cup of untouched coffee. Everything inside me seemed exhausted beyond emotion. The public confrontation, the accusations, the humiliation hanging in the air like smoke afterward. None of it erased the simple truth that the man being questioned by federal investigators was still my son. A few minutes later, Vanessa approached slowly and sat across from me. For the first time since I had known her, she looked completely stripped of performance. No dramatic smile, no influencer voice, no carefully arranged confidence, only fear. She admitted she knew Ethan had financial problems, but she insisted she never understood how serious things had become. Months earlier, Ethan lost his position at the real estate investment firm in Santa Barbara. Instead of telling anyone, he continued pretending to leave for work every morning while secretly trying to salvage collapsing investments and mounting debt. Listening to her felt surreal. All those photographs online, all those glamorous vacations and expensive dinners. Beneath the surface, everything had already been collapsing. Vanessa confessed that she constantly pressured Ethan without realizing the damage she caused. Luxury had become normal inside their world. Social media transformed every relationship into competition. Every influencer couple they knew seemed richer, happier, younger, more successful. And Ethan became obsessed with keeping up. I suddenly understood something painful about my son. He built his entire identity around appearances because deep down he was terrified people would discover he felt inadequate. An hour later, one of the investigators quietly informed me Ethan wanted to speak with me privately before formal questioning continued. The conversation took place inside a small airport security interview room with gray walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. Gone were the expensive clothes, the polished image, the confident performance. Ethan looked emotionally shattered, sitting alone at the metal table. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then the truth finally began spilling out of him. The debts became impossible to control after several failed investments. Investors threatened lawsuits. Creditors called constantly. Ethan admitted he feared humiliation more than criminal charges. Somewhere inside his panic, he convinced himself one successful investment could replace everything before I ever discovered the theft. As he spoke, I realized he inherited Richard's fear of failure without inheriting Richard's discipline. Then the conversation turned darker. Ethan revisited old childhood wounds I spent years trying not to examine too closely. He described growing up feeling emotionally abandoned while I focused on expanding the gallery and maintaining appearances within wealthy social circles. And quietly, painfully, I admitted some of it was true. For too many years, I confused financial security with love, but betrayal was still his choice. When I finally said those words aloud, Ethan lowered his head and began crying silently, not dramatically, not manipulatively, just broken. After several minutes, he asked whether I hated him now. I could not answer. Instead, my eyes drifted toward Richard's vintage gold watch, still wrapped around Ethan's wrist. I asked softly for it back. Without resistance, he removed it slowly and placed it into my hand. The weight of it nearly broke me. Outside the room, investigators prepared to transfer Ethan for formal questioning. Vanessa stood near the hallway but made no effort to follow him. Their marriage already looked like something collapsing in slow motion. Before disappearing down the corridor, Ethan turned toward me one final time and asked whether I planned to testify against him. I looked at my son carefully before answering. For the first time in my life, I am finally going to tell the truth. And as strangers escorted him away beneath the cold airport lights, I realized losing a child emotionally can hurt even more than losing them physically. If you are still watching after that heartbreaking airport confrontation, comment number 6 below and tell me how you think this story should end. Now, let's move into Chapter 7, where the consequences begin destroying everything Ethan tried to protect. Several weeks passed after the confrontation at Los Angeles International Airport, yet the silence inside my Scottsdale house still felt unbearably loud. The immediate shock had faded, replaced by something heavier and far more exhausting. Every room carried memories I could no longer escape. Richard's empty chair in the den, Ethan's childhood photographs lining the hallway. Even the backyard roses seemed neglected, despite my efforts to care for them. The airport live stream spread across social media faster than I ever imagined possible. By the second week, national entertainment websites were reposting clips of Vanessa's recording, alongside headlines describing wealthy children stealing from elderly parents. Reporters framed the story as both financial scandal and family tragedy. Some online commenters defended me passionately. Others criticized me for exposing my own son publicly. I hated all of it. Neighbors who once waved casually during morning walks now looked at me with uncomfortable sympathy. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others lingered too long beside my mailbox, asking gentle questions designed to hide obvious curiosity. Humiliation settled over me like dust. Meanwhile, Ethan's carefully constructed life collapsed piece by piece. Federal investigators froze accounts connected to his shell company. Several investors filed lawsuits almost immediately after the fraud investigation became public. Vanessa lost sponsorship contracts within days. Luxury brands that once celebrated her glamorous image suddenly removed every trace of her online presence. Watching everything unravel brought me no satisfaction, only sadness. Harold Bennett continued updating me regularly. The Family Protection Trust Richard created officially activated once investigators confirmed the financial fraud. Ethan permanently lost inheritance rights connected to our estate. The news hit me harder than expected. Part of me felt relieved knowing the house and remaining savings were finally protected. Another part mourned what the decision symbolized. Richard had built that trust believing there might come a day when our own son needed to be legally kept away from us. And somehow, he had been right. One evening, while cleaning an upstairs storage closet, I discovered several old home videotapes packed inside dusty boxes. I found an old player in the garage and spent hours watching scenes from decades earlier flicker across the television screen. Young Ethan running through sprinklers in the backyard, Richard teaching him to throw a baseball, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations before money, and appearances poisoned everything between us. For the first time since the airport, I cried openly, not for the stolen money, not even for the public humiliation. I cried for the version of my son that no longer existed. A few days later, Vanessa called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded exhausted and stripped of all vanity. She told me she officially filed for divorce after discovering Ethan hid far more debt than she ever knew. Surprisingly, she did not blame him alone. She admitted their obsession with luxury and social media approval slowly destroyed their marriage long before the fraud began. She apologized sincerely for encouraging the constant pressure to appear successful online. Listening to her, I realized I no longer felt hatred toward either of them, only distance. Soon afterward, I quietly began attending support meetings in Phoenix for elderly victims of financial exploitation. Sitting among strangers who shared stories about betrayal by children, grandchildren, and spouses changed something inside me. For the first time, I understood I was not uniquely foolish. Late one night, I received official notice from federal prosecutors confirming Ethan's indictment on multiple fraud charges. Included inside the documents were potential prison sentence estimates. I stared at Ethan's elementary school photograph beside my bed for a very long time afterward, and deep down, I finally understood that the consequences had become irreversible. By early November, the desert mornings in Scottsdale finally began to cool. The brutal summer heat faded into softer sunlight and crisp air drifting through the neighborhood at dawn. For the first time in months, I started opening the windows again. The house still carried loneliness, but it no longer felt haunted. Life slowly rebuilt itself through routine. I returned to trimming roses in the mornings and taking longer walks through the neighborhood after dinner. Some days remained painfully heavy, especially when unexpected memories surfaced, but grief no longer consumed every hour of my life. I continued attending elder financial abuse support meetings in Phoenix each week. At first, I only listened quietly while strangers described betrayals that sounded painfully familiar. Sons draining retirement accounts, grandchildren forging signatures, caregivers manipulating isolated widows. Eventually, people began asking for my advice. My years managing an art gallery and investment account suddenly became useful again. I started helping retirees organize financial records, secure passwords, and recognize suspicious digital activity before serious damage occurred. For the first time since Richard died, I felt valuable for reasons unrelated to being a wife or mother. Around that time, Harold Bennett informed me that federal prosecutors had begun negotiating plea agreements with Ethan's attorneys. The evidence against him remained overwhelming, but cooperation could potentially reduce prison time. Hearing that reopened wounds I thought were beginning to close. Several nights, I sat at the kitchen table attempting to write letters to Ethan. Every version ended the same way, torn paper scattered across the trash can beside me. I still did not know how to balance accountability with forgiveness. One afternoon, during a trip to California for legal meetings, I drove past my old gallery building in Santa Barbara for the first time in years. Younger owners operated the space now. Modern artwork filled the windows where my exhibitions once stood. Sitting alone across the street, I remembered all the evenings Ethan ate dinner without me, while I stayed late preparing shows or entertaining wealthy collectors. I remember school performances I missed and weekends consumed by business travel. I could finally admit the truth. I failed him emotionally in many ways, but I also understood something equally important. My failures did not force Ethan to become dishonest. Soon afterward, I officially began volunteering with a nonprofit organization that educated elderly people about financial scams and digital fraud. Teaching others how to protect themselves transformed something inside me. The shame I carried slowly became purpose instead. One evening, Vanessa mailed additional divorce paperwork connected to shared financial disclosures. Inside the envelope, she included a handwritten apology. She admitted Ethan spent most of his adult life trying desperately to earn Richard's approval, even years after Richard's death. Reading those words hurt deeply because they sounded true. Still, Ethan made his own choices repeatedly. A week later, Ethan requested a supervised phone call through his attorneys. I nearly declined. When I finally accepted, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered, older somehow. For the first time, he apologized without excuses. No blame, no anger, only fear. He admitted prison terrified him. I sat silently for several moments before finally telling him something I should have said years earlier. I loved him even when I failed him. On the other end of the line, I heard him begin crying quietly. When the call ended, I did not feel healed completely, but I no longer saw myself only as a victim or failed mother. Several days later, I received an invitation to speak publicly at an elder fraud awareness conference in Phoenix. And for the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something to fear. If you are still here and emotionally invested in what happens next, comment number 8 below before we head into the final conclusion of this story. Because sometimes the ending is not about revenge at all, but about finally learning how to survive the pain honestly. The morning of Ethan's sentencing arrived cold and strangely quiet. Phoenix rarely felt cold to me anymore, yet as I walked toward the federal courthouse carrying Richard's vintage watch inside my purse, the air seemed sharp enough to cut through skin. I never imagined motherhood could end inside a courtroom. The building itself felt sterile and emotionally empty. Gray walls, security checkpoints, families sitting silently beside exhausted attorneys. Everywhere I looked, people carried some private tragedy they never expected to survive. When Ethan entered the courtroom, I barely recognized him. The expensive confidence was gone. He looked thinner, older, emotionally hollowed out by months of investigation and public collapse. At first, he refused to look at me. Vanessa appeared briefly for financial testimony related to the fraud investigation. The distance between them was obvious now. Whatever remained of their marriage existed only on paper. As prosecutors outlined the details of Ethan's crimes, I felt fresh waves of grief settle inside me. Forged signatures, shell companies, elder financial exploitation, additional investors harmed through fraudulent real estate schemes. My son had not simply betrayed me. He had slowly become someone neither Richard nor I would recognize. His attorney emphasized cooperation, remorse, and partial financial recovery efforts. Because Ethan accepted a plea agreement, prosecutors recommended a reduced sentence. Listening to strangers summarize my family's destruction in legal language felt surreal. Then the judge invited me to speak. I walked slowly toward the podium, aware of Ethan finally watching me directly. The courtroom became painfully silent. I explained that losing money was devastating, but losing trust hurt far more deeply. I admitted my own failures honestly. Too many years spent prioritizing work, appearances, and financial security over emotional closeness. But I also said something I needed Ethan to hear. Pain explains behavior. It does not excuse betrayal. As I spoke, Ethan lowered his head and began crying openly. I told the court I no longer wanted revenge. Revenge had already consumed enough of our lives. What mattered now was truth, accountability, and whatever healing remained possible afterward. Then I said the words that had lived inside me for months. A parent can survive burying dreams. What destroys them is watching their child bury their own conscience. Even the judge looked emotional afterward. When sentencing finally came, Ethan received a reduced but meaningful federal prison sentence, along with restitution requirements and permanent financial restrictions. He looked toward me one final time after the hearing ended. Inside his expression, I saw shame, grief, and something painfully close to love. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions I ignored completely. Vanessa quietly approached me before leaving and thanked me for showing compassion despite everything. I wished her well sincerely. That evening, back in Scottsdale, I returned Richard's watch to his old study. While opening the desk drawer, I noticed an unopened handwritten letter hidden beneath old documents. And suddenly, I realized some truths arrive only after everything else has already fallen apart. Several weeks after Ethan's sentencing, winter finally settled gently over Scottsdale. The desert evenings felt cooler now, calmer somehow, as if the world itself had grown quieter after months of chaos. One night, I sat alone inside Richard's study, holding the unopened letter I found hidden in his desk drawer. For days, I avoided reading it. Part of me feared reopening wounds that had barely started healing, but eventually, I unfolded the paper carefully. Richard's handwriting immediately brought tears to my eyes. The letter had been written shortly before his death. He admitted he worried Ethan spent his entire life confusing success with personal worth. More painfully, Richard confessed he blamed himself too. He wrote that he pushed Ethan too hard, praised achievement too often, and unintentionally taught our son to fear failure more than dishonesty. Then I reached one sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. Love explains people. It does not excuse them. For the first time in years, I cried without anger. In the months that followed, I began speaking publicly at elder financial abuse conferences across Arizona. Telling my story no longer filled me with shame. Elderly strangers approached me afterward, sharing their own stories of betrayal, loneliness, and survival. Slowly, my pain became useful. I restored my rose garden. I repainted parts of the house that had remained untouched since Richard died. I even reopened rooms I once avoided because grief lived too heavily inside them. Ethan occasionally wrote letters from prison. Over time, the arrogance disappeared from his words. He finally admitted how empty his obsession with wealth and status had become. I rarely replied, but when I did, I answered honestly. One evening near sunset, I stood alone overlooking the desert outside Scottsdale and quietly removed my wedding ring for the first time since Richard's death. I placed it gently into my pocket instead of wearing it, not because I stopped loving him, but because I was finally ready to continue living. At 68 years old, I finally understood surviving betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of learning how to live honestly again. Sometimes the deepest betrayals do not come from strangers, but from the people we once trusted with our hearts. Yet life has a strange way of teaching that pain does not have to become the end of us. Loss can break illusions, but it can also reveal strength we never knew we carried inside. Some wounds never fully disappear, though with time they become reminders instead of prisons. Real healing begins the moment we stop sacrificing our peace to save people who refuse to face themselves honestly. In the end, dignity, truth, and self-respect matter more than pride, money, or appearances ever will. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart in any way, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more emotional family stories and meaningful journeys of resilience and healing.